Okay, with that, I now call upon the first speaker of the proposition to introduce the proposition case for 8 minutes.
Can everybody hear me?
No.
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 No? Okay. A few hundred years ago, the Spanish discovered more gold the world had ever seen in the Aztec Empire, modern-day Mexico. They brought that gold back home with them and began trading it to the British and to the Dutch. The British and Dutch developed strong textile and manufacturing industries in response, and slowly sucked away the Spanish supply of gold. At the end of the century, the Spanish realized that they had accrued a massive amount of money, but not wealth. And we see in the modern age, the United States and Europe have faced the same crisis as Spain. They've inflated themselves silly. They've existed in resource-based economies and service-based economies, where waiters and salesmen are ultimately subservient to those who produce products for them, where they've taken raw resources, sold them to the Chinese, and bought them back at a higher price as finished goods. All of this money, but not wealth, at the end of the day, has been sent and spent where? China. The United States has run out of gold. It's in the context of this American decline that today, we, the proposition, want to set this debate to show that the 21st century will be China's century. But before we do that, we're going to have to set out a criteria. And our criteria is going to be as follows. We're going to look at past examples of empires. The 2nd century Roman Empire, the British 19th century, the American 20th century. Ultimately, historians are going to look back upon this and say, okay, it was clearly the Chinese who ruled this century. And specifically, we think China is going to do so through a combination of economic strength and diplomatic pressure throughout the world. And we think these criteria are the burdens we have to satisfy in order to win today. So the 3 contentions we're going to be bringing forward to you are going to be as follows. Firstly, the Chinese structure. Secondly, Chinese foreign policy. And finally, the Chinese economic strategy and why it will prevail in the 21st century. That's going to be handled by my partner, Graeme. Let's jump right into this point about the Chinese structure. So what we see is that in the world today, the doom of autocracy has been predicted far too soon by nations. We think that the Chinese model of government is a lot more stable than the Western model, and frankly, a lot better suited to handle the challenges of the 21st century. Let's dive into why this is. We can take a look at China's state capitalism as a brilliant example of this. During the 2008 financial crisis, what happened was that Western governments let companies like AIG and Lehman Brothers mortgage the entire country's economic future on their dealings, allowed them to take risks that were insane, huge, and ultimately ended the country in a huge financial crisis. The Chinese model of state capitalism is capitalism with the reins held by the government, where bubbles and speculation as such are not allowed to happen. Where companies like Lehman Brothers and AIG aren't allowed to operate in China in reckless manners like this, where a lot of corporations that deal in the financial sector are owned by the Chinese government. And we see China's continuing economic growth, its stability, its 10% per year for the past 30 years to be a clear indication that they haven't allowed bubbles to form. Any capitalist economy with the growth potential of China would have had a bubble and crashed 20 years ago with 40% growth every year until they finally crash. Because ultimately, the Chinese government places the reins on the capitalist system and holds it back from going insane, but allows it to produce continuous profit. Furthermore, the biggest issue that we've seen develop in democracies in the 21st century is the difference between electing lawyers who know how to talk and scientists who know what they're doing. And what we see is that in China, they have a regime run by engineers, run by scientists, run by economists, run by people who are specialists in a certain domain that aids them in creating government policy. But rather what we see in the West, and I'll take you in a moment, is that lawyers are elected. People like Mitt Romney or Barack Obama, for example. People who know how to speak, but ultimately need advisors that tell them what to do, and don't really understand the material they're dealing with, being governments.
And yet doesn't the role of the Chinese government as unelected body be itself corruption and other problems which we're trying to face with democracy?
The other great thing about an authoritarian system like China is that they can institute reforms like they did on Thursday. Singapore, another autocratic regime doesn't suffer from corruption for a very simple reason. They execute those who engage in corruption. China on Thursday announced that anybody convicted of corruption over $100,000 will be executed. You can't do these kinds of things in a democracy to weed out corruption. But the Chinese government can, because they can say, we don't care about your right not to be executed, your right to life. If you're convicted of corruption over $100,000, we're going to execute you. End of the story. Done. Okay. So what we see overall, furthermore, is that China has a government structure that's a lot more streamlined and efficient than Western governments. We see that the federal government handles chiefly economics and foreign policy, and then leaves local governments to do pretty much everything else. And ultimately, the Chinese people do have a say in some of their local governments as opposed to the Fed. So we think this structure, where they allow local governments who know local issues better to deal with those local issues, is a lot more streamlined and efficient compared to the Western system. And finally, back to the state capitalism for a moment, we do see that the Chinese know what they're doing in comparison with these lawyers in the West. The Chinese jumped ship from the U.S. housing market, all their investments, in 2005, 3 years before everybody else saw the bubble collapse under them. The United States government, United States corporations, were still heavily invested. That's why the 2008 financial crisis was so tough. Let's look at the second idea of foreign policy now. So what we see is that all grand empires throughout history have functioned on a principle of essentially international imperialism in their sphere of influence. And China has begun this process in both Africa and home in Asia. We see that Africa is ripe for Chinese imperialism and colonialism. We see that essentially China provides Africa low-interest loans and donations like the African Union headquarters. They send them doctors to treat patients. And what China receives in return is resources, precious metals. 40% of the Nigerian oil industry is owned by China or Chinese corporations. But beyond monetary wealth that they gain from this, which is extremely important, they gain themselves a sphere of influence. They gain themselves lapdogs who are willing to work for them on the world stage. Africa will not go back to the West due to their history of colonialism, but they seem ready to accept China. And furthermore, we see at home in Asia, China has been in fishing disputes, border disputes with India, Japan, and Korea. And they've won most of these. They've won a border dispute with India. They've won a fishing dispute with Japan and Korea. Ultimately, they've built a sphere of influence at home and abroad. And we see this as important for constructing your worldwide empire. We see this as the beginnings of the Chinese empire. That in order to truly rule a century, you have to influence the world around you. And China has begun to do that. So what have we shown you today in the first government speech? We've shown you that the Chinese system is a lot more streamlined, a lot more efficient than the United States, than the Western system in general. And that's why China will dominate the 21st century. Because their autocratic system allows them to make decisions to weed out any corruption that's there by summarily executing it, whereas you can't do these sort of things in a democracy. Furthermore, we've seen that the Chinese foreign policy extends throughout the globe, that they're winning these border disputes, these fishing disputes, and they found themselves a ripe market for